One of the topics you've written about quite a bit lately is kind of this general idea that people who are secular and think that they're beyond Christianity and they've gotten beyond religion and they are now people of science or reason or whatever, and yet they're still stuck on the morality of religion. So walk us through that.
Yeah, when you're a fish swimming in water, you don't know that water is what you're in. It's just the world to you, and that's the way that I think a lot of people think about morality and altruism. Altruism's the only morality they've ever known, and they equate it with morality as such. And so they think if I'm going to be a moral person, whether I'm a Christian, Jewish, atheist, doesn't matter. That's about not caring too much about my own interests. It's about sacrificing them to others. And part of the reason I'm interested in this question is because I think there are secular people out there, some of whom are more rational than others, and who pride themselves in not being religious, and because they think religion's irrational. But if they were to realize that the morality that they treat as a given, that they think is the only morality there ever was, is actually a product of religious thinking and religious ideas, I think they would drop it. And so there's some work to do there with showing them that that's in fact true. That if you look at the logic of altruism, it ultimately comes from religious ideas. If you look at the history of altruism, it comes from historical religion. And one thing we see today, I think, is certain strains of secular thinking, certain kinds of movements, especially on the left, which is traditionally the secular wing of our politics. It's becoming more and more obvious that the morality that they rely on is a religious morality. And the two movements that I have in mind here are, one of them is wokeism, and the other is effective altruism.
So before we get to those, let's take a step back and talk a little about what altruism means and what it means in the culture, and then so let's start with that. What does altruism actually mean? I mean, a lot of people, when you mention altruism, I think generally in the culture they'll say, yeah, it's being nice, it's being polite, it's opening doors, it's thinking about the other, it's taking other people's, the effect that your actions have on other people into account.
Why is so it's important that it's not that, really. Because, a lot of people use it simply as a synonym for benevolence or any kind of other regarding behavior, and that's the big mistake. Altruism is a moral theory that says that you derive your moral justification for living by, from service to others. So you can have egoistic reasons, self-interested reasons for having the regard for the rights of others, even for helping certain other people out in certain cases. That's not altruism. Altruism is the idea that morality is all about other people, and especially about sacrificing yourself to other people.
And what in this context does sacrificing mean? When we say sacrificing to other people, again, people have a very benevolent interpretation of sacrifice. I mean, Jordan Peterson goes on and on in some of his videos about, you invest now and you reap the benefits in the future, and he conflates sacrifice with investment. What does the word sacrifice actually mean? What do we mean, and what should it mean in the culture?
It means giving up a greater value for a lesser value, or for a non-value. It means not, for instance, you love your wife is sick, you spend a lot of money to save her life. It means, I don't know, spend the same amount of money but for saving a stranger, or spend more money to save lots of strangers who mean nothing to you, which, by the way, is exactly what the effective altruists are advocating these days.
Yeah, strangers 10,000 years from now. not just
Depends on which version of effective
yes.
altruism, but yeah.
So altruism is about sacrifice, about rejection of your own values. The word itself, the concept itself, in the way we use it today, I think was coined by Comte, the French philosopher.
Yes.
So is it a modern concept? Is this a generated from modern philosophy?
I mean, the term is definitely pretty modern because it comes from Comte, who's 19th century French philosopher. But the idea of it, that this is the primary concern of morality, certainly goes back before Comte. It goes back, you see it even in secular philosophers earlier than Comte. You see it in Immanuel Kant in various forms. You see it in the utilitarians. You see it in Hume in certain ways. And you obviously see it in Christianity. And Christianity, I wouldn't say is quite the same as altruism, because altruism is the idea that it's other people who are the moral target. They're the ones who give your life moral justification. For Christianity, other people are of secondary concern to your moral obligations to God. But of course, God is still someone other than yourself, and you're still supposed to sacrifice for him. And the first thing he usually tells you is to give things to other people, in order to please him. So a lot of these doctrines fundamentally come from religion for that reason.
So can you walk us through how particularly Christianity, but religion generally, is altruistic? What is it about the teachings that lead to a morality, an explicit morality of altruism?
Well, the first thing to say, I think, is that once you get clear on how altruism's not primarily about just doing nice things for people, which you can have self-interested reasons to do, it's a little easier to understand. And there's a second point to make on top of that, which is that it's not even really about helping people, even though it professes to be about helping people. It's much more about sacrifice as an end in itself. It's much more about the importance of giving up. And then, of course, other people are just kind of an excuse to give things up.
I mean, the importance of denying to yourself.
Right. And when you understand that that's what's really at the core of the idea, it gets a lot easier to see how this is coming out of religion. Because, I mean, one of the key concepts in religious morality is the virtue, the alleged virtue of humility, and the idea that there's a sin in pride. And humility is, that's a concept I think you see in religious morality well before they start talking about altruism. You often see it even before they start talking about sacrifice. But what humility is, in fact, is the idea you are nothing. You should think of yourself as low, as worthless, and that you only gain any kind of moral meaning by recognizing your worthlessness and your dependency on some higher power that you need to bow before, that you need to submit yourself to. And that submission is, I think, the form then that sacrifice to others ends up taking.
It's yes, it's your pain, your suffering, whether somebody else benefits from it is irrelevant. It's kind of anti-self is at the core of the kind of religious perspective on altruism. Why do you think altruism requires religion? I mean, you mentioned that earlier, that really to justify, you have to go back to religion.
Well, I mean, first of all, it requires some worldview that's going to give the altruist a reason to think that he's worthless. Religion serves that up ready-made in all kinds of ways because of original sin, because of the idea that there's this higher power that's, by comparison to which you are worthless. And there's, I think, secular versions of that. You see it, for instance, in, I think, modern wokeism, where there's a version of original sin. We're all racists, and The higher power that we submit ourselves to is to the victims of oppression, in effect. But you also need and this is, I think, very important and something I've only really started to appreciate sufficiently in the last few years. The reliance on religious faith is essential, because on top of the point that what altruism is really all about is not about helping, it's about giving up. The most important thing that altruists want you to give up is your reliance on your own independent judgment. And that's what religious faith encourages. And it's what any number of forms of secular faith, secular reliance on emotions, secular shaming people for wanting to know for themselves, they do the same thing. Mm-hmm. And so, and in fact, if you look at some of the, if you look at any of the various secular forms of altruism, they all rest their case for altruism on some kind of irrationalism, some kind of reliance on emotions, which amount to their secular version of a faith.
So is this the point? Rand makes the point of, to really demolish altruism, all you have to do is ask why.
Yeah.
And they have no answer, right? They have no answer other than to point at an ancient book or to say it's revealed truth. And
there's no earthly reason, and no earthly reason has ever been given.
Yeah. And so how does it sustain itself? Like, I mean, we've gone through an enlightenment. People can be incredibly rational, incredibly reasonable, in the secular world when it comes to a lot of different issues. But it seems like when it comes to altruism, almost nobody is willing to accept an alternative. Nobody is willing to challenge it. Nobody's willing to question it. It really is, the one thing that everybody agrees on in one form or another. And you said earlier, they equate it with morality. It's exactly that. You can't even get through to them because every time you say morality, they hear altruism. So you can't actually put self-interest and morality in the same place because they have them in two complete different compartments in their file system. They can't unite them. So what do you think it is that has made it so sticky, so prevalent that there's just nothing else?
Well, there's an easier answer and a harder answer to that question. I think the easier answer is to say all the different altruistic and religious philosophers who've been pushing this for centuries, if not millennia, who give it intellectual credibility, who influence each other, who create an intellectual establishment in favor of it. And there's plenty to say about that. But I actually gave a talk last summer at OCON called Ayn Rand's Genealogy of Altruism, where the major focus of the talk was, well, take for granted that altruism is not rational. It doesn't have a rational basis. So it doesn't come from rational reasons. It's got to come from irrational reasons. And so you can explain that by pointing to what the philosophers have said. But at a certain point, you have to stop the regress back in history and say, well, some of these philosophers just came up with the idea for bad reasons, and it's ultimately a psychological explanation. There are a lot of psychological explanations that you can point to that explain what incentivizes people to believe in altruism. It's not a good incentive. It's not any kind of self-interested incentive. It's a defense value. It's a source of it's something that they embrace out of fear, out of hatred of other people for one reason or another. And there's a range of different kinds of motivations. Some of them more understandable, some of them much less innocent. Everything from simple just fear of disagreement with other people, and other people tell me that this is what morality is all about, so I better go along with the herd, on to a desire to appease other people because you are maybe a young intellectual and you want to be able to claim you want to be able to use your mind somewhat independently, but if you do that too much, you'll be seen as selfish, and so you need to explain, well, I'm really doing this for the sake of the greater good. That's the kind of altruism as appeasement motivation, all the way to simple envy and power lust, where you know you can control people through guilt, and you know, and you also really hate and are afraid of the people who exercise their own independent judgment. They do something that you decided not to do, and it reminds you of your own guilt for not having decided to choose for yourself, to think for yourself. And so you go to war with people like that on the premise of, I can prove that, if I can convince them to believe this altruistic faith, I'll have put one over on them and shown them that you don't have to think for yourself to live.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to me how successful altruism has been, and the people who really rebel against it tend to be either pragmatists or kind of nihilists. And of course they're rebelling against it by in some way embracing it. So other than Rand, nobody has ever really thought through an alternative, and that makes her achievement so much greater. I mean, we've gone through well over 2,000 years where nobody has considered an alternative to altruism, and she has.
I mean, there's a place where someone asked her, I can't remember who it was, why she was able to come up with her ideas when no one else was. Is it some special intelligence that you had? And she was insistent that it wasn't any special intelligence, although I think we can agree she was pretty smart. Yeah. She was insistent that it was honesty, that she was more honest than other philosophers. And you have to be supremely intellectually honest to be willing to break with so many intellectual authorities on a topic like the morality of altruism.
Thank you for listening or watching the Yaron Brook Show. If you'd like to support the show, we make it as easy as possible for you to trade with me. You get value from listening. You get value from watching. Show your appreciation. You can do that by going to yaronbrookshow.com/support, by going to Patreon, Subscribestar, Locals, and just making a appropriate contribution on any one of those channels. Also, if you'd like to see the Yaron Brook Show grow, please consider sharing our content, and of course, subscribe. Press that little bell button right down there on YouTube so that you get an announcement when we go live. And for those of you who are already subscribers and those of you who are already supporters of the show, thank you. I very much appreciate it.